We are recording this webinar, so we'll put a summary out afterwards with a link to the webinar and the PowerPoint. We're going to mostly use this PowerPoint today, but Nate Argo, who will be doing most of the talking during today's session, will also be doing a little screen sharing. The slides are in the TAC folder. I do have an agenda in there, but it's a rather smallish agenda, so I'm just going to go over it from the slide deck. And these Google Slides, of course, are in the TAC folder as well, so you're welcome to check them out in there. We won't be presenting via the Google Slides. We'll be using it, the Connect SharePod here instead. And let me go ahead and see if Scott Cheney is in the webinar. Is Scott joining us this morning? I just saw Scott pop in there. Scott, let me know when you have audio. And while we're waiting for Scott, and Scott, feel free to just, I don't know, put a note in the chat or just talk while I'm talking so I know you have your audio connected. So this morning, we just wanted to go over some really quick updates. We covered quite a few updates for Credential Engine during the last TAC at the end of January, so we're not going to recover all that information we covered last time. We'll just give you a couple updates on what's going on, and we're going to largely focus on the structure and format of data in the registry. During the last TAC meeting, this was requested, and so this is a follow-on to that request. And then I'm hoping for the next TAC meeting, we'll look more at the search endpoint, because I think we've covered the publishing side, all the publishing options that are available, the new account system. We're now looking at what is that structure of the data in the registry, and then we'll follow up with that on, well, how do I get the data out from the search endpoints that are available from the registry as well. And then Stuart Sutton is on, and he's going to just talk just a little bit at the end about planning for the March TAC with CTDL work that we would like to pursue with all of you, and he could fill you in on that, and we'll be looking for some volunteers to work on that. Let me go ahead and pause for a moment, Scott, and see if you have audio.
I do.
Hi. Morning.
Morning.
Would you like to cover anything on the first 3 slides that I put in there just as a quick update, or would you like me to go ahead and do it? Either way is great.
I'm going to be happy just to let you do it, and we'll be able to buzz right through it and get to the real meat of the webinar.
Yeah, we're all about the meat of the presentation today. Okay. So let me just cover these real quick, and then as usual, everyone, nobody is muted. The chat is available. Feel free to, talk away, ask questions, and make comments and so forth. So just real quick update on the credentials in the publisher and the registry. And at the last TAC, we talked about all those publishing options and how through the publisher, there's a bulk upload and manual entry. So when I talk about the publisher, it's really encompassing both bulk upload and the publisher and the registry. And as of this graph being created about a week ago, it was 2,201. It's probably increased by now. And as always, you can see a breakdown of the types of credentials here to give you an idea of those who have set up an account in the Credential Engine account system, indicated they want to publish, have been given access to publish. We can get a good idea of what they're publishing here. I do want to add to this that Mike Parsons, who is on with the Credential Engine team, and Jeff Gran with Capella, I'm trying to see if Jeff is in the attendee list, is going off the screen here, have been working together on using the Registry Assistant API. So Capella will be the first to publish using the API. And they were wrapping up yesterday a conversation about final tweaks to the metadata to go ahead and publish to the registry, so this doesn't include their credentials as well. And hey Mike Parsons, just real quick, what was that quantity of credentials? When you get, hey Mike, if you don't have audio, put it in the chat. And I also just want to mention that with the Capella credentials, it's a mix of all the degree types, well, bachelor's and on up, and certificates as well. So can't wait to see those pop into the registries. Robbie, are the labels self-determined by the people who enter them? Yeah, they are self-determined, and actually when we get into the metadata, we can maybe talk a little bit more about what you're calling as a label, and those are those credential types that are actually classes in the CTDL. They're not concepts, they're classes. And yes, the publisher is selecting the type of credential that they offer. This next slide gives you a breakdown of what the registry participants so far look like. Now, since we presented last time on the account system that's now available, I do believe this number has gone up. We're seeing new accounts coming in just constantly now, which is really exciting. But for these 200 registry participants, again, you can just kind of see a breakdown of the type of credentialing organizations or quality assurance bodies that are going into the Credential Engine account system, creating those accounts and indicating their willingness to publish, and then moving forward with that publishing. And just a few pieces of information that's new from the Credential Engine. I'm pretty sure that during the last TAC we had this in the presentation, and the deadline is coming up really close, so I just wanted to push this up at the top and let everyone know, if you haven't checked this out, if you know of a state that partner that you're working with, or maybe you are with a state and you haven't looked at it, yes, time is of the essence. But you know what, you got the weekend coming up, so you can work on the proposal. Credential Engine is requesting proposals for working with states, strategies to publish to the Credential Engine's Credential Registry. And for those of you who attended the launch or participated with the launch online, it was being videotaped, and that has been kind of condensed into a newly released launch video. Take a look at the video. There are several fact sheets now available on the Credential Engine site for anyone to download and use as PDF. And the Credential Engine Communications manager, Carrie Sampson, is looking for people to share their stories on blogs and on social media. So if you do have a story to tell, please do reach out to Carrie. And next week we have our next application showcase. So if you haven't registered for that, please do. It will feature LRNG and NOCD, and it will go over a couple of examples on how they see integrating data from the Credential Registry with their applications for their customers. And let me just pause there for a moment and see if anybody has anything to add to that, or if there's any other questions. Thanks, Carrie, for putting that registration in. Carrie just went ahead and put the Eventbrite link in to register for the showcase webinar. If you haven't already, please do go ahead and do that. And John asked for an idea of the other category. John, you were referring to the organization subtypes, I think. And off the top of my head, I do not. Emily Raffel is on. Maybe she can address that in the chat. Emily or Scarlett's on as well. Maybe one of you can take a look at that and address that in the chat for John. Okay, so let's move on to the bulk of the presentation today on the structure and format of data in the registry. And as we're doing that, I do want to check and see if Steve Midgley is on the webinar. Steve?
I am. Hi. Sorry, I arrived a little late, but I'm
good. Yeah, so I just want to make sure that everybody is aware that Steve, of course, as Nate's going over the slides, you can feel free to tag team and, of course, cover the chat. But I do want everyone to know that Steve Midgley and his team are the Credential Registry architects and developers, and so they can answer any questions that you have. So today, as I was saying, we are going to focus on the aspect of the structure and format of data in the registry. So Nate Argo is going to go over on the data input side, the JSON LD encoded CTDL metadata. So he's going to cover that, show you what that looks like, that data as it goes into the registry, then what it looks like when it's stored in the registry, and then the credential registry envelope that contains that JSON LD encoded CTDL metadata that's available on the other side of the registry as data to come out of it. And as I had mentioned, there are search endpoints, and we're not going to get into those today, but that would be a good follow-up topic that we could cover possibly in the March or if not the April TAC. Of course, ask questions, put your comments in the chat, and I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Nate. Nate, do you have audio?
Yep.
Nate, could you speak up just a little louder? Better.
Okay, how's this? Okay. All right, so what we want to go over today is the actual structure and format of the data that's in the registry itself. So everything in the registry comes sort of wrapped in an envelope, and that envelope contains metadata about whatever the resource inside it is. And we call the resource the payload, basically. So here we see in this graphic kind of a depiction of the two basic types of entities. So you've got the various payloads here, and that's anything that is a CTDL encoded metadata object, and those are going to be relating to each other via the URIs and the properties and everything that we cover in the schema. And then we also have the envelope object, which serves as sort of a wrapper around the data, or around the payload, I should say. It provides information like when that data was published. It provides ways to link back to previous versions of that data. It provides information about who published that data. It's basically metadata on top of the metadata, and we'll go a bit more into that in a few slides. But first, we're going to cover some things in the payload itself after we cover this. So the Credential Registry contains three kind of major chunks or types of data in addition to the metadata that you would get out of it. So that's going to be these guys here, is the slide we just looked at. We have the managed signing keys. These are not publicly exposed, but we use these internally to match them up to the organizations that publish the data. So that's related to the account system and stuff we went over in the last PAC meeting. And then, of course, we have the list of organizations that are registered within the registry itself to do publishing. This is different from the CTDL organization metadata things. These are just records that indicate that some organization has a set of essentially managed signing keys to publish records. And I'm sure that Steve can go into a lot more detail than I can on that one. And just a quick overview of the CTDL schema itself and the JSON LD format that we're going to be talking about. So CTDL is an RDF-based schema for conveying information about credentials and all the things that it takes to earn those credentials. We developed it for use both on the open web and in the registry, so it's not something that's meant to be just in the registry. We definitely want to encourage as many of our partners as possible to use this on their websites and in other other systems that they may build or in APIs and whatnot. And then in the context of the registry, the payloads of the registry envelopes are always encoded with CTDL metadata that is encoded using JSON LD. Sorry. And the reason that we do this is to maximize the compatibility with other systems. We want to make it easy to consume the data. We want to make sure that it's easy to convert that to other RDF formats. And we also want to make sure that it's still human readable. And JSON happens to be quite good at that. So what we're going to take a look at here is an example of some data from the registry. So what you're seeing here is a screenshot of the Credential Finder application, and we will be showing some more of this a little bit later. But what we have here is kind of a nice presentation of the actual metadata that's in the registry. And this will go back to the earlier slide we had where we show the credential, which is essentially everything on the screen here, and how it relates to the organization that published it. And in this case, the organization, if you can see that, offers and owns the credential. And then over on the right, we have the required learning opportunity. So there are other top-level entities as well. There's assessments and competency frameworks. There's some manifests and some other things too. But for the sake of this example, we're kind of focusing on these three sort of entities here. So the structure of the envelope, there's sort of two major parts to it. There's the data that's on the envelope itself, and then the payload. So the envelope itself is referenced via a URI, which is the data, or the thing you would put into a browser or that a machine would use to go and retrieve the data. And then the envelope itself also contains the ID, which is at the end of the URI in our specification. It contains information about who published the payload. And that relates back to the earlier slide where we had the list of registered publishers. It contains the revision history for the CTID of the payload, and that's how you kind of manage the difference between versions and new CTIDs, and we'll go into detail on that a little bit later. It also contains dates for when that data was created, updated, or deleted. And I want to note that deletes in the registry, because one of the purposes, are we getting some audio feedback? Anyway, one of the purposes of the registry is to archive data. So whenever something gets deleted, there's a way of marking it deleted without it actually being deleted. And that's kind of what that date would be for. The payload, on the other hand, is two kind of major chunks. There's the signed copy of the data that was published, and again that goes back to the earlier slide where we had the managed signing keys. And what that allows is for anyone who consumes this data later on, whether they get it from the registry or from archive.org or wherever else, to compare the payload against the signature and ensure that the payload is exactly what it's supposed to be. And then, of course, there's the unencrypted sort of plain text, what's still JSON LD encoded, CTDL metadata itself. And within that, you're going to find both the URI to that entity and the CTID of whatever that thing is in the registry. And you'll also find within that data references via URI to other CTDL entities, which again goes back to the earlier slide. So this is a screenshot of what the JSON LD looks like for the payload. This is using a browser extension that kind of makes it a little bit easier to read and provides some nice colors and formatting and whatnot. Inside the envelope, there's a number of properties, one of which is the coded resource, and that's what holds the human readable version of the payload. And you can see, maybe bring the slide up to the full screen there. You can see the various properties and values in that. So the payload contains everything that is published, and it's brought over verbatim. So we don't alter the payload at all, as that would break the signatures. So exactly whatever you see in the registry in the payload is exactly what was published. And so we've got a few sort of things to look at here. At the top we have the envelope URI, which contains the envelope's ID at the end of it. And we have the resource URI, which contains the CTID at the end of it. So there's sort of two significant differences here. So the envelope, if you pull the URI for the envelope, you will get back, well, the envelope obviously, but that will contain the payload within it. So that's how you get everything, if you want all the information that we have on a given resource. If you just want the payload, then you would use the second thing there, the resource URI. And you can see that the structure of those URIs is a little bit different, but thematically they're sort of the same thing. You have the domain, and then a little bit in the middle, and then the identifier at the end. So we try to keep that really simple to sort of figure out. And then of course down below that, you see that in the payload the CTID has its own property and value there, so that you don't have to try to pull it out of the URI. So here we see a little bit more of the payload we were looking at before, and we'll take a look at this example a little bit later. So remember in the earlier slide, we've got this sort of graphic over there on the right, we mentioned that the payloads would reference each other, and this sort of shows that. So you've got in the first box here, the credential that we're looking at is owned by this organization as represented by this identifier here. So if you were to be viewing this in a browser or in some other system and you were to follow that URI, you would get the payload for that organization. And then a little bit further down inside of the requires property, which holds a condition profile, which holds a reference to the required learning opportunity, you'd have the same thing. So you would click on that, or you would navigate to that somehow, and you would get the payload for that learning opportunity. And that's basically how the entities within the CTDL relate to each other. So hold on for a second. I see we've got a lot of activity in the chat. Are there any questions so far? Or is Steve handling it? Looks like Steve might be handling it.
Steve has been manning the chat. Anything come up, Steve, that you would like to mention?
No, I mean, I think we're getting through it. Let's see, Stuart's got a question at the bottom, so we can. So what's the utility of the CTD other than providing, or so that word I'm not sure, but for being part of the URI for the resource? Yeah, so I'm not sure to what part of the system you're talking, Stuart, so maybe I'm jumping.
Yeah, I can jump in. I thought this might be a question that people might have. And that was, we have CTID. The CTID is concatenated on the namespace to provide the URI for the resource. And I thought, well, some might be wondering, well, are there other uses of the CTID? What's the CTID for? Why is it in the payload as opposed to just being URI? Is it used elsewhere in the system? The CTID itself.
Yeah, well, so it's used, I mean, you kind of can answer this question yourself. You know more about this than I do. Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. So yeah, the CTID is basically intended to be sort of a product identifier. If you want to compare it to like an ISBN number or something of that nature, it's a unique identifier to the whatever the thing is. And it started out as being an identifier just for credentials, but as the system sort of evolved, we started using it as an identifier for any what we call top-level thing within the registry. So that's going to be your credentials, organizations, assessments, learning opportunities, and a few other things. In addition to competencies and competency frameworks, and in the near future, we hope concepts and concept schemes. So the idea is that not only could you use that in the registry, but because it is based, it's essentially just CE- and then a standard UUID, the idea is that you could use that within any other system to uniquely identify that thing without having to come up with your own identifier and then tie that to a CTID or go through some sort of a more complicated process like that. So it's not just for use in the registry, although the registry is certainly the sort of major use case for it currently. We do intend that to be used between other systems that want to communicate information about credentials and the related entities.
So Nate, this is Robbie. So for example, in the competency part is an example where there are likely and often external IDs that are human readable and intelligible to other communities, and then an internal ID that the CTID references. So it's important to have those two different things.
Yeah,
and certainly you can have multiple different kinds of identifiers for something. It's just that we wanted to provide the CTID as a way of I guess, recognizing a credential that is registered in the well, that's the other thing, actually. The one way to check to see if something is registered in the registry is to look it up by its CTID. So again, it's not the only way you'd use it, but it is the sort of major use case for it.
Thanks.
Right, and I mean, I think to the core of this, right, the CTID is the unique ID that defines an entity. And let's take the simple case of a credential. And so as you're using it out in the world, right, you may want to refer to these things in lots of different applications, and this is the sort of canonical entry. And if you ever want to and the reason it's tagged CE at the front is to indicate in a sort of four-man URI that, oh, that's a thing that can link back to the credential engine so that you can come back here and know that you should find this record in the credential engine registry.
Nate just,
Right.
Nate Otto just, oh, sorry.
I was just going to say real quick that the CE dash in front of it also sort of namespaces the UUID, so that even if you ever did manage to create the same UUID somewhere else, having a CE dash in front of it does make it even more unique. But yeah, go ahead, Stuart.
Nothing. I was just noting that Nate Otto just put in a question about, about the URI.
And I think I understand, Nate, but maybe you can characterize if you're on audio also. Just give us a little bit more on that question to make sure I answer or we answer the right question.
The one that Nate Otto just posted?
Yeah.
Oh,
yeah.
Yeah.
Hey,
so
Nate, can you clarify it?
Oh, the envelope ID.
Well, maybe you well, sorry, I was talking to Nate Otto, but Nate, maybe if you understand it, feel free to answer it. I just wasn't sure if Nate Otto. Sorry, bad to Nate. Nate Otto, I don't know if you can clarify that question. I see it, but I'm not sure I'm not 100% clear what you're asking.
I think what he's asking is how do you go from having just the payload to getting the envelope ID, if I'm correct.
Nate,
is that what you're getting at?
Are you having trouble with audio? It looks like you're talking, but.
Oh, can you guys not hear me?
Well, no, you just keep talking. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think Nate has interpreted my question correctly. It relates to the previous question, which is, so the envelope URI and the payload IDs are different, but if you're only seeing payload IDs in payloads, then that's the next thing you're going to request. How does anyone ever discover the envelope URIs, and what's the utility of them if they're never published in payloads?
You can look up the envelope from the CTID, so you can always walk back out of the naked payload, right? The competency or credential or whatever it is. You can always take that CTID, which is included there, and say, hey, give me the resource for the CTID. So you can always walk it back that way. Now, we could include, and this would be an optional feature, I don't think we have done this, but we could include, a additional piece of metadata in that resource payload that says envelope is here, if that's useful to have a linked data pathway.
Sure. So there are multiple envelopes over time for the same CTID.
Yeah. We actually will be going
no,
into
sorry.
that,
Let me just. Yeah. There are multiple versions of the same envelope, to be clear. So we version the envelopes.
I think Nate is going to show that in just a moment. Maybe it would help to just go ahead, because I think that's being covered on the data out on the next segment. Can we go ahead and cover that and then make sure that we address all the questions, Nate Otto's question, and it looks like Robbie has a question too, but let's go ahead and go, because that's what Nate is now going to cover in the presentation. Go ahead.
Yeah, so the idea for this slide here is just to sort of provide a little transition between the focus on the payload and the focus on the envelope section. So essentially what we're saying here is that you can either get the payload or the envelope that contains the payload, and the payload will always be whatever was published. And you can use the signature within the envelope to verify that. So the next section here kind of focuses a bit more on what's in the envelope, and so you have of course the URI for the envelope. The envelope provides its own ID in there, so that you don't have to pull it out of the URI. It provides information about who published the payload, the format. It holds the signed copy of the resource. Provides a few other things, and then the sort of big part here is going to be the revision history. So this is what Steve was just talking about a second ago, where we sort of depicted it as multiple envelopes here, just for an easier visualization of it. But technically, it is multiple versions of the same envelope. So they would have the same ID or the same URI, sorry, but to which you would append /revisions / a number, and we'll go into a little bit more detail in that, and that's how you would get to the different versions. So first we're going to look at the properties of the revision history here. You have the head property, which is just a simple Boolean that tells you whether or not the current, or whether or not that revision history item is the most recent one. You have the event, which tells you whether or not that revision history is for when that envelope was first created or whenever it was updated. You have created at, which is the date and time that that revision was published to the registry. You have an actor entity that is intended to convey who published that revision, and currently we do not use that, but that is there in the system. You have the URL, which is basically everything that is in the URI after the domain that will get you to that envelope. And I believe we had an example on the previous slide that showed that. Well, actually, we've got some more on the later slide, I think. Show that in a bit more detail. So we'll get to that. So again, here we've depicted the envelopes as sort of separate boxes just to make it easier to visualize, but they are technically the same envelopes, different versions of it. So the idea here is that if you pull the envelope by just its URI with no revision appended to it, you will get the revision history along with everything else. And that revision history contains a list of references that we just went over to previous envelopes, all the way back to the first one. And each envelope is issued a revision ID, which is sort of in addition to its URI. And every CTID has its own set of envelopes. So if you publish a resource that has a different CTID, you're going to create a whole new revision history, and it will be up to the fields in the payload to sort of reference which resource or which CTID was being replaced by the new one. And again, we'll go into a bit more detail on that. So here we see some examples of what the revision, I don't know what you call it, revision URIs, I suppose, what they look like. So you see that they're the same all the way up until you get to /revisions and then the ID of the revision itself. So again, if you pull that URI without the revision part, you'll get the latest, whatever the latest data is for that envelope. You'll also get the revision history object within it. If you want to see that envelope as it was at the point in time when it was published, then you would pull that specific URI for that revision. And that's about it for that slide there. I thought I heard something. Is someone trying to ask a question? Okay. So again, the one thing we wanted to sort of go into a little bit more detail on is the difference between different versions of something and different CTIDs for something. So the idea, sort of at a high level, is that a CTID, again, is a product identifier basically for a credential or for some other thing that's related to a credential. And as long as you're making revisions to that credential that don't, I guess, significantly change it, and what significant means, we leave that up to the publisher. The idea, I think, in general that we sort of advise is if you can use one version of this credential in place of another version of it and there wouldn't be any problems, then that's generally going to be the same CTID, just different versions of it. But if something changes, that it, so it's like if say the costs change or where it's offered changes or something like that, that is different and it's significant, but it's not, I guess, semantically a different credential, then that would be different versions of that data. But if you actually change the credential itself, like maybe you change the competencies it requires, or maybe you change some other aspect of its requirements, or what it will get you, what its advanced standing for, that kind of thing, if it's different enough to semantically be a different thing, then you would issue it a new CTID. And again, we leave that judgment up to the publishers of the data. But whenever you do that, whenever you issue a new CTID, you are creating a whole new chain of revision history. And that's what this is intended to show here. And again, it's up to the payload within the envelope to reference the previous CTID as a way of saying that, you know, this thing replaces that thing. Okay, so going back to the example that we sort of started out with, a way to view all of this information for a given resource, we provided that in the Credential Finder application, which I believe, yep, Jeannie just linked to there. And if you scroll all the way to the bottom, and I'll go ahead and fire up the screen share on my end here. If you scroll all the way to the bottom there, you will find an icon for the JSON LD icon here, and what this shows you is a couple of things. So when you click on that you're going to be presented with a window that is, oh, sorry, screen share. I should probably pull it up. There we go. All right, so I'll start over. So down here at the very bottom of the page, on the right, you'll have this icon, and when you click on that, you're presented with a window that looks like this. What this contains is a few pieces of really useful information here. So you've got the CTID for whatever the resource is that you're looking at. You've got a link to the envelope, which is also the ID for that envelope. You've got a link to view that resource, just the payload itself in the registry. You've got the raw metadata here. So again, this is the payload, but this is represented here in, it's basically just presented here to make it easier to consume sort of visually if you wanted to scan down it and look up something without having to open it up in a new tab and have some kind of a viewer installed that sort of will format this. So the reason this looks so nice is because I've got an extension that does that. Otherwise, it's very compact JSON. But we provide this here so that you don't have to do that. So all of that information is available just by clicking this icon here at the bottom right of any detail page in the Credential Finder. And that's a fairly new thing that we've just added and sort of updated to make it easier to get to. And if we want to take a look at the difference between an envelope and a payload in sort of a real-world example. So this is the envelope, and you'll notice, again, some of the data about the envelope here. You've got the resource, the signed copy of the resource. So this is a great big chunk of text here, and the reason this is here is so that you could compare that against the decoded one to make sure that the decoded one hasn't been tampered with. Then you've got the decoded resource that we were looking at throughout the presentation. And all of these URIs here are pointing to other resources in the registry, and they point directly to the payloads for those. And down at the bottom, past the resource, we've got a bit more information. So we see the format, the encoding, some other nice stuff about that, and then we get to the revision history. So again, you've got the various parts of that, including the URL to get to that envelope for that specific revision. And of course, the created, updated, deleted dates. And so that you get for the envelope URI. For the payload URI, you just get the payload.
Nate, before you, can you go back to the envelope URI?
Sure.
I think Nate Otto is asking where the public key is. So I think you can scroll up and show where the public key is included. It's all the way, I think it's near, it's above the, yeah, it's down here, yeah. Maybe it's not. Scroll up. There is we do include the public key, or at least we did last time I checked. Maybe it's underneath the decoded resource. Yeah, it's not in, this is all just the encoding, just the base 64, JWT stuff. Yeah, there should be, yeah, okay, yeah, maybe you can copy that link into the chat and then everyone can play with it themselves. That's a good, thanks, Nate. All right.
There we go.
Let the games begin.
All right. That'll do it for that. I think that was about it. Unless I'm forgetting something. Oops, over that. Okay, so any questions on all of that? I wasn't able to pay attention to the chat while I was doing all that that talking, so I don't know if I missed anything.
So there was a
directly
promise.
with me, or-
There was a promise that this would, that we were holding some questions until you got through. I think Nate, you had a question, and we were holding to see whether the slides answered the question. So maybe we should explicitly return to those or ask.
Sure. I'm not sure that it's completely unanswered. I was just interested in where in the resources would one discover the envelope IDs or the envelope references from other things that you might be already looking at. Are these things that would you come across the envelope URIs just in normal operation of the system. Fritz shared a URL to he said a listing of all envelopes, and it contained, a handful of envelopes. I don't know, maybe you could just go into a couple seconds worth of more detail on that.
So envelopes are, I mean, just in general, and what Fritz shared, I think, is, provides some list, but I believe it's a extended list, meaning it's paginated in some way. I haven't looked at that raw page in a while, but I think what you're getting at is what is the purpose of the envelope and the envelope ID? Will we see them in the wild? Why do I care about envelope IDs? Is that roughly that sort of line of question, or?
Right, yeah. I mean, I saw you show one in the Credential Finder interface. Where else do they appear besides in other envelopes, I guess?
So envelopes are essentially the bookkeeping system to allow us to track records in a sort of public and open way. So rather than just have rows and columns in a database, which we could have taken the approach where each envelope is just a row and a column in a database, we wanted to expose all of the metadata that describes a record inside the system as an entity itself. And so that's what the envelope serves to do. For many people, and Stuart I credit with the sort of driving push to get us to fully realize this, for many or most people, they care about the CTID and they want to link and manage relationships between CTIDs. And so for them, envelopes are really uninteresting, that they would just deep link into the resource and operate against all the metadata that's there. That's really the CTDL and the Credential Engine project at its core. But there will be some groups, probably API developers and sort of, other infrastructure or platform providers who will care about historical data, about signatures, about various components of the resources, and they can rely on the envelopes where they need them. But I think we anticipate that most application developers won't care about envelopes at all. I don't know, is that getting you closer, Nate, Otto?
Yeah, sure. I mean, revision history is interesting to me, and of course the signatures are interesting to me, as you can tell as well.
Yeah.
Is there a property in the CTID identified, payload itself that just has the envelope URI, or is that a property that should be added?
Yeah, so we could add so this is the design dilemma there. So the decoded resource that you see is a perfect reflection of the base64 encoded JWT signed entity. So you can take the decoded resource, combine it with a public key, and verify that that is in fact what you were looking at in the JWT right now. So we could inject some additional metadata into the decoded resource, but then it wouldn't be a perfect reflection of the JWT that was provided by the publisher. So we had to decide whether or not to do that.
Oh, so the envelope ID is generated after you've generated the JWT.
Correct. We generate the envelope IDs, and the publisher just simply provides us a JWT. So when you go to publish, you just hand a JWT over. That's your job, basically. There's some authentication, authorization stuff that happens at the API level, but that's different. Yeah, the post is just a JWT. So we tried to leave that as a pretty clean system. So the publisher has no relationship to the envelope ID.
Sure, but then
as I said, it's sort of a metadata record.
As the resource changes over time, right? Version 2 is going to have a different JWT, which probably is actually more JWS than a JWT. It's going to have a different JWT, but then the relationship between that and the original envelope ID doesn't change at all, because that ID is the same across all revisions.
That's right. Exactly. So the CTID doesn't change across revisions, and the baseline envelope ID doesn't change. Although, as you've seen, that we append these sort of revision elements to the URI of the envelope ID.
Okay, cool. Thanks. That covers the question, except for the where is the key information.
Yeah, the key information right now is magic in the sense that you have a CTID, you have to know that you can provide that CTID to a URI that will return you the envelope, or you can provide that CTID to a URI that will return you the naked resource itself.
Yeah, but
you can hand it to either one of those two APIs.
The public key is what?
Say again?
Where
Oh yeah, the public key. Yeah, sorry. That should be. So I'm looking at this, and I believe that I would call this just a bug, and it's on me, that the public key is supposed to be returned in the envelope, and I can't see it here, so I'm going to go sort of dig into where it is or why it's not being returned today. We are holding the public key when, from the publisher, and it's not here. So
okay, well, no pressure on the bug. I'm sure you'll fix that. Do you have information in the CTDL terms list or something to describe how you describe the public key when it does appear?
That's in the envelope, not the CTDL, so just to be clear.
Sure, but yeah, you
the
have a
envelope
vocabulary
specification
that
should
describes
include.
how you publish that information.
Yeah, so I will get that and return it to the list. That's my job.
Cool. I work on the Open Badges spec, of course, and we have a cryptographic key class. I'm just interested in seeing, whether you referenced any other specifications in constructing your representation of a key, who you were talking to, and what it looks like. I mean, what the possibilities for good compatibility between these specs are in the future.
Yeah, I think we'd be really open to anything. We were relying, as you say, on JWS, not JWT, but we just used the generic term. But yeah, that's as far as we've gone. We talked with the web signing guys at W3C, but we just elected not to go forward with that until they can agree on final, which I don't know when that's going to happen.
Cool, thanks.
Yeah, we'd be happy to harmonize your public key info, I think.
Let me ask a harebrained question, and having Nate Otto on maybe can help. And I can try and frame the question, but I don't know enough about it to frame it intelligently, so please forgive me. But if we look at this history that is maintained over time, and we're out a little ways. In other words, we've got a fairly considerable history, like maybe 10 years of a credential and its histories. Is that data, that historical data of use downstream with awarded credentials, if aligned somehow with the date in which someone earned it, and referencing that to the history to know the state of the credential at the point where it was earned? Or am I way off?
No, I don't think you're off at all, Stuart. I think that's definitely a use case that we've seen in the showcases, that the intention of this revision history also supporting.
Okay, thanks. It just dawned on me that trying to think of other things that the history would be.
Yeah.
No, I think that's the primary use, where somebody is trying to say they earned this version of the CTID. The CTID itself doesn't have a version info, so they could use the envelope to point to it was this metadata representation which was earned, not the CTID. That's definitely something people may choose to include in addition to the CTID if they want to lock it to a particular point in time.
Yeah. Yeah, I see Carrie's coming in on that one too. So yeah. Anyway, thanks. I
see the chat is still going there, so good discussion today, everyone. Any other open questions in the chat, or anybody else want to go ahead and ask a question?
Is Phil still open?
I think Nate.
So what you're saying there, Phil, is a byproduct of some of the older data that was in the registry. We've got to go back and kind of update a few of the records. That was just
Oh,
a development thing.
Okay.
It should have the full URI in the ID.
Okay, that's good. That's good. Thank you.
okay.
Back to you, Nate.
All right, well, actually, I think it's
It's mine.
to you, Stuart.
All right. I just want to do.
Yeah, I could try to cover Stuart's part, but I wouldn't do a very good job.
It's going to be brief. We're actually going to be out of here on time or early. At our next TAC meeting on March 23rd, what we want to do is have an open discussion, presentations from those people in the community, amongst you and so forth, around enabling pathways. It's been on our agenda from the beginning or early on, and it's time now to begin incubating it and coming up with some conclusions as to what it should be. So on the call on the 23rd, we're not going to begin with 40 minutes of presentation. We really want to have an open discussion around the possibilities, what the credential engine role the credential engine should play in pathways. We also want to make sure that we are not reinventing the wheel or working in contradiction to some other thing that is in process. For example, Nate, Otto, I know there's, coming out of concentric sky and badges, there is a potential open standard for pathways. So what we want to do is we want to talk. And between now and then, we would love to have people raise their hand, Nate, maybe you, to do some presenting around what people who have already embarked on that journey around pathways are doing, so that we can ride along towards some common specifications about how to do it. So we've not at this point had any preconceived notions of whether we're talking about learning pathways, career pathways, some combination of two, or whether we're looking at prescribed pathways or pathways that are defined by users as a history of where my path, or pathways that are a little more freewheeling than prescriptive paths. We want all of that to be part of it. All of that to be part of this conversation. And by the way, I ripped off the diagram on the left there from Carla. I don't think Carla's on the call. Anyway, I hope she would be honored. Anyway, and my little sense down in the right that pathways are somewhat like transit systems, of getting from one place to the next. Anyway, so that's the goal for the 23rd. And if you've got some stuff, of course, be there and you can contribute orally. But if you got something that you might want to present a little more formally, just let Jeannie know, and we can take it from there. Does that make sense, folks?
Yeah.
Yeah, there's.
Yep. So we'll definitely be taking Nate Otto up on his offer, and anyone else who offers, you're in. So just let us know.
So anyway, that was the shortest thing you've ever heard from me.
We'll make up for it next time, Stuart. So that's it. Thanks everyone for joining today. We do have a few minutes left. If there are additional questions or discussion anybody would like to talk about, in addition to the discussion that Stuart was talking about for next week, and I think we need to get more into the whole search thing, and I think that would answer also some of Nate Otto's questions. Maybe if it's not the next TAC, the following. If you have any other requests of deep dives that you would like us to do, please let us know. We want to make sure that we're providing that opportunity and getting your feedback on it. So we appreciate all of your comments and questions and feedback. Well, all right, not hearing anything else, let me go ahead and sign off. Thanks again, everyone. Have a wonderful day.
Bye-bye.
Bye all.
Thanks, everybody.